Our next speaker is Norman Lamb MP. You might have noticed Norman creep in just before, because we were all looking for him earlier. He was a little bit late. Someone wanted to make a joke about the Lib Dems going missing, but that was not me, Norman, okay? I think we'll all know Norman for the absolutely fantastic work that he has been doing surrounding mental health, and I think that we're all worse off now with you not in that minister position. But yeah, he doesn't really need an introduction, does he? So, Norman Lamb MP.
Blimey, this is a bit daunting and very, very hard to follow the amazing Sarah Ryan. I've got immense respect and admiration for Sarah. I met her when I was minister. We were together at an event, a curry party, I seem to remember, in London, and rather horrifyingly, I knew nothing about the death at that moment of Sarah's son, and she talked to me about it, and from that moment on we agreed to work together to confront some deeply troubling issues about our health and care system, and we continue to work together trying to persuade the Health and Safety Executive to consider what happened in terms of a possible criminal prosecution. But it has taken this long. How long after? 3 years, and the Health and Safety Executive has not yet made a decision on whether to prosecute that trust, and that for me is shocking. So I've got great admiration for her fortitude, her dignity, and the extent to which she is fighting, for me, a moral cause here. And what I wanted to start by doing was to reflect on some of the experiences that I had as a minister, which I found deeply troubling and which made me feel that I had to confront as best I could some of these issues. And I wanted to just tell 3 stories very briefly. First of all, in the aftermath of Winterbourne View, I said that I wanted the families of the people who had suffered the most appalling abuse to come into the Department of Health to talk to me. So I wanted to hear it from them. And I remember still to this day a father called Steve Sollers talking about his son and talking about how he watched the deterioration of his son's condition. He described to me how his son became increasingly zombie-like. And obviously there was just an increasing use of antipsychotic drugs to control him within that institution. And we all know of the horrors of what went on in that institution, but in a way what really shocked me was that he said to me that he went to complain about this to the local authority and at that time the Primary Care Trust. And he said no one listened to me. No one took what I was saying. Blimey, this is worrying. Can you not hear me? Is that better? Right, okay. No one took me seriously. And he said, I felt guilty as a father that I couldn't do anything for my son. Now, what are we doing here? Putting a parent in that situation where a public body, which is supposed to be there to look out for people and to take up their concerns, was ignoring him. And so I was deeply horrified by that. And then I was asked by a family to visit an institution run by a third sector organisation, receiving a very, very substantial income every year from the NHS, from NHS England, to see their daughter. Their daughter was a 15-year-old girl, and she had autism. And I went to this organisation, and I was taken down to her room, which I have to say was essentially a cell. I was then taken into an adjacent room, which was the seclusion room, where she was repeatedly placed. This room, remember this is a 15-year-old girl, had nothing in it apart from a padded bench. There was a small exercise yard off her room. She was behaving in response to the treatment she was receiving, increasingly like an animal. She was taking her clothes off the whole time. She was clearly in a state of very substantial distress. She had no life, effectively. She was constantly subject to restraint and seclusion. I was told by the family that there were clear breaches of the Mental Health Act. This is all care, in inverted commas, funded by the taxpayer, arranged and organised by NHS England. And the aunt, who happened to be a clinical psychologist, so she had someone fighting for her, told me that it had taken months to find out from the organisation who the commissioner was, who had put her there, who was funding it. They wouldn't tell her anything. So I raised this case and got it reviewed, and eventually this young girl got out of there. And what is amazing, and this will be subject of a television programme coming up quite soon, she is now leading a good life. She is happy. She has grown massively as an individual. And the behaviour and state that she was in was clearly driven by the circumstances in which she was kept and in effect detained as if she was in prison. And I found that deeply shocking. And then there is a 9-year-old boy in my constituency whose parents I know quite well. And they had concerns that their son might be on the autistic spectrum. And he was referred by the GP. And the family was told that it would take 3 years to get a diagnosis. 3 years. Now, this is not unusual. This is standard across the country. And yet we know that speedy access to effective treatment can make a massive difference to a child's life chances. And yet the system in our country deems it appropriate to make families wait that long. It's scandalous, and we must not tolerate it. And then finally, just by way of example of the sort of things that drove me to confront this system, was our own family experience, because we have a son, now 28, but at the age of 16 he was diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder. And it's fair to say that in the period since then, we've gone through years of emotional turmoil. We've had real challenges as a family with a very, very challenging condition. And there were times when we were badly let down by the NHS. We were told when he was 18 or 19 that his treatment would start in 6 months' time. And we were desperate at that point, and we did, I suspect, what any family would do in those circumstances if they could. We paid for treatment for him. But how can we possibly justify a situation where people who have money can get access to treatment and people who don't have money are left waiting? And then when they finally receive treatment, get treatment that is often below the standard that we know is most effective. And again, I don't think we can tolerate that in a society, and I think we have to confront it and challenge it constantly. So, for me, I find it shocking that our publicly funded National Health Service, to which we all, I suspect, in this room pledge allegiance, ends up through the decisions of governments discriminating against people with mental ill health, with learning disability and with autism. People, in a sense, who are not in the focus of the government's attention get neglected. This is the truth of it. They do not have equal treatment. And that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable that there is this continuing injustice in our publicly funded NHS. And so we need to confront it. Let's just think about some of the elements of that. First of all, on funding. Now, mental health receives something around 11% of the total NHS budget, despite the fact that as a percentage of the total disease burden, it's about 23%. Children and young people's mental health gets about 0.7% of the total NHS budget, despite the fact that we know that about 75% of adult mental ill health, starts before the age of 18. Now, we secured in the final budget of the coalition an extra 1.25 billion for children and young people's mental health. It was supposed to be £250 million a year for the next 5 years as additional funding. So what's happened in the first year, 15-16, it was 143 million, not 250 million. And out of that 140 million, not all of the money that was dispersed around the country has ended up being spent on children's mental health. It's been diverted into other parts of the NHS. And that's what happens. Because here is the thing. In the last decade, they introduced maximum waiting time standards in the NHS, a move that I totally supported. I remember my first debate as a new MP in 2001 was on orthopaedic waiting times in Norfolk, and people were waiting at that time 2 to 3 years for an operation, and it was awful. People waiting often in absolute pain. So the government was absolutely right to introduce maximum waiting times. But here's the thing, they left out mental health. There were no maximum waiting times in mental health. And this directs where the money goes. And I've seen it myself. Every Monday morning in the Secretary of State's office, there is an obsessive focus on every hospital in our country, on their performance against the 4-hour A&E standard, against the cancer waiting time standards, against the 18-week referral to treatment standard. And so the whole system is focused on trying as best they can to meet those standards. And as every extra patient goes to hospital, with payment by results, more money goes to those hospitals. And so with a clinical commissioning group with a defined budget, something else has to give. And here's the thing, it's always mental health. A bit is trimmed off around the country. And so the net result is that mental health always loses out. And so that's why I argued in government for the same rights to access on a timely basis in mental health as in physical health. The same right to access to treatment. And incidentally, it's not just access to any old treatment, it's access to evidence-based treatment. And one of the 2 waiting time standards I introduced, the 2-week standard for early intervention in psychosis, has a massive evidence base to support it. We know that if you intervene quickly with youngsters who have a first episode of psychosis, you have the chance of rescuing that person, of giving that person the chance of a good life, of working like all the rest of us take for granted. But if you neglect that condition, the chances are that that person will have a life on benefits, a life with difficult relationships, a pretty miserable life. So the case for intervening is overwhelming morally, but it's also powerful economically as well. If you invest £1 in early intervention services, you get a return of £15 over a 10-year period. So why not do it? And yet the implementation of that standard has been completely flawed. In most parts of the country, they are just not spending sufficient resources to deliver the evidence-based treatment programme which will enable those people to recover and to lead a good life. And as Geraldine Strathdee, the former National Clinical Director, said to me, it's a bit like saying to a cancer patient, you can have your chemotherapy, but we can't afford the radiotherapy, sorry. Well, just imagine what the Daily Mail would be saying in that situation. When I raised this over the summer, none of the newspapers commented on it. That's the disadvantage that is always suffered by people with mental ill health. And it's also the research funding gap. About 5.5% of public funding for research in medicine goes into mental health, compared, as I say, with a disease burden of about 23%. How can we justify that? And as Sarah has so rightly said, it's also the culture and the attitudes and the sense, too often, that people are treated as second-class citizens, not quite as worth support and good treatment and dignity and respect as others. and we can't begin to tolerate that. And I should just say, as I address the really shameful failures of the system in so many ways, I am totally aware, and I saw it constantly, of really amazing people around the country working in services, seeking to change culture and attitudes. And I have enormous admiration for those people, often working against the system rather than with it. And these dreadful practices, as I say, have to be confronted. And there are things in mental health that must be challenged. The fact that every day of the year there are people who are sent out of area to beds sometimes hundreds of miles away from home. We know that there is an increased risk of suicide when you send someone to a bed away from their home area, and yet we keep doing it. And I've called for the practice to end within a year, and it's possible to do that if there was the will. The government has said it will end by 2020, but I have no real confidence that that will be the case. We have to confront the dreadful excessive use of restraint, of seclusion, and even the use of tasers by police officers coming into mental health and learning disability units as a means of control. And I was talking to the head of the International Initiative on Mental Health Leadership, and they've done a study of the use of tasers internationally, and certainly his private view is that it should simply be banned. I tabled an amendment to the Policing and Crime Bill to ban the use of tasers in mental health settings. It was rejected by the government. So why is this situation as it is? Well, I think it is all born out of the stigma that attaches to mental ill health, the sense of a conspiracy of silence, the sense that until recently, families who experience mental ill health felt unable to talk about it. It was the same many, many years ago with cancer, and this is a challenge for the whole of society. And things are changing. The brilliant Time to Change campaign has confronted attitudes about mental health, and things are making a difference. So lots of leaders, including, wonderfully, the former Prime Minister of Norway, who took time off work because he was suffering from depression. People in business, people in sport, in music, in politics, coming out and talking about their mental ill health, bringing it out into the open. Our own son talked on television with me last year about everything he has been through, including the fact that at times he has felt suicidal. Getting these things into the public domain is vital if we are to change attitudes of government. And I think we have got to the point now in the development of our society where government now says the right things. The rhetoric is now quite good. So just imagine, would we have ever expected a new Prime Minister in the first speech that she makes to actually refer to the importance of improving the experience of people with mental ill health? I welcome that. But the gap between the rhetoric and the reality is vast. And that's the gap that we have to bridge. So I wanted to end by just identifying some priorities which I think we need to confront. First of all, there is no doubt in my view that we need more resources in mental health and indeed in learning disability and in autism. We can't begin to tolerate the outrage of children waiting 3 years, for example, for a diagnosis for autism. We can't begin to tolerate the lack of access standards, and to introduce those access standards, you need resources, you need upfront resources. I believe that you will see a return on that investment in due course, but you need the investment upfront, and it is long overdue. Secondly, we need new legal rights. Now, Sarah, in the aftermath of her son's tragic death, campaigned for a new bill in Parliament, and what I did as Minister was to get Sarah and her colleagues into the department to talk to officials, and it led to the publication of a green paper before the general election last year, and it set out proposals for a number of reforms of new legal rights to allow individuals and their families to challenge decisions that are made about their care, to challenge where they are placed in terms of their care, to give people control over the budget that is available for their care. Now, sadly, that Green Paper remains unimplemented. There have been no changes to the rights that individuals have. But I reached the conclusion that we cannot rely on NHS England as a bureaucracy to follow through on the commitments they have made. They made very powerful commitments early in my time as Minister in 2012 in a document which we published as a concordat of agreed actions that they would take, they and others would take. And tragically, nothing really happened, particularly in terms of getting people out of institutions where they were able to live a better life with support in the community. So new legal rights, I believe, are essential, including amendments to the Mental Health Act as well. Third, we need an equilibrium of rights of access to treatment, to good evidence-based treatment. We cannot any longer tolerate the inequality of rights of people within our publicly funded NHS. Fourth, I think we have to confront the need to integrate much more effectively physical health care and mental health care. We have the remarkable situation where we manage to neglect the physical health needs of people with mental ill health, so that people with severe and enduring mental ill health die on average 15 to 20 years younger than other people. Again, completely intolerable, but often because they have not had the same access to treatment as others enjoy as a regular course. And that needs to change. But we also, incidentally, managed to ignore the mental health needs of people with physical health problems. Many people living with chronic physical health conditions have real psychological needs which are too often neglected. So marrying the two together and treating people holistically seems to me to be fundamental. Fifth, we have to confront this culture, the culture that Sarah so passionately talked about. And that can only be done by a constant challenge to the system, a challenge to things when they go wrong, when people are failed, making it absolutely clear, and government making it clear, that things are intolerable. Instead, we have seen with the Southern NHS Trust, the chief executive who presided over the care that Connor received, who presided over large numbers of unexpected deaths that weren't investigated, continuing in her job and then being offered a job on the same salary of close to £250,000 a year, total package, advising GPs. Now, can't there be any accountability here? Unless we confront failures of care, things will never change. And then finally, we also have to think about how we use money in services as well as the total sum that we spend. And we have to, it seems to me, seek to achieve a fundamental shift of resource from what I would call containment to prevention and recovery. The Schizophrenia Commission back in 2012 identified this. We spend a fortune within the system containing people with no ambition for their lives at all. And instead of that, as they have done in Sheffield with the very impressive new National Clinical Director, Tim Kendall, they have repatriated people from out-of-area placements. They have reduced the length of stay. They have closed down beds. And they have used the money saved to massively improve the care received within the community, improving crisis support for families as well. That is the direction that we need to take. And along with that, we need to end the awful silos that too often exist within government. I tried to address the fact that we spend a fortune on people paying benefits to those who are out of work because of their mental ill health. And yet we don't spend money on the treatment that could enable them to get back into work. So let's join up employment services with mental health services much more effectively. I'm chairing a commission on mental health in the West Midlands, and we will come out with an action plan over the next few weeks, and it's about getting people back into work who have severe and enduring mental ill health, investing in individual placement and support, which we know works, but where the investment is never made. It's about helping people keep in employment, rather than allowing them to drift out of work because nothing is done to support them. It's about getting people into good quality housing, because all of us take housing for granted as the foundation stone of enabling us to function as individuals. Yet for so many people with mental ill health or with learning disability, it's the reward at the end of a very long process. It should be available as a human right up front. And we have to stop the flow of people with mental ill health and with learning disability into the criminal justice system, and we will be coming forward with proposals for that as well. So let me end by saying that there is nothing that government could do which could have a bigger impact on the well-being of society than to end this appalling neglect, institutional neglect by the state, of people who absolutely deserve the same right as anyone else to be treated with dignity, with respect, and to do everything we can to give them the chance of a good, happy life. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Right, we're going to open it up for some questions now. So we've got a good 20 minutes or so for some questions. We've got some Roman mics. So straight up there with his hand up, straight in, no messing about. Sit down.
Not yet. Testing 1, 2. Yes, are we there now?
There you go.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Wow, that was very powerful stuff. Thank you very much indeed. My name is Peter Edwards. I'm a human rights lawyer. Norman, I feel ambivalent about you. I admire you immensely, but I'm not sure I can forgive you for creating and supporting the industry called safeguarding, which, of course, you placed into statute through the Care Act. I just wonder whether either you or Sarah have a view on the millions, as I see, wasted, the resources wasted, the time wasted in investigating minutiae, when the absolute scandals that you describe, which are classic abuse, seem to fall completely outside.
Well, look, I'd be very... I'm not sure I particularly welcome your sort of... your language of not showing whether you can forgive me. I don't know whether that's particularly helpful. My own view, I'd be very happy to talk to you and to hear your views, and if you want to write to me and if you want to meet with me, then I'd be happy to do so, if we can have a constructive discussion. I also think that those minutiae that you describe are often issues of incredible importance to individuals, and I know in my own county of Norfolk, if I think about looked after children who are often very badly let down by the system, there has to be some mechanism to investigate and consider concerns that people raise. And I'm not sure whether you're suggesting that we ignore those concerns. It's absolutely right to challenge the system and to see whether it's working effectively or not. But I absolutely think there has to be a mechanism to consider concerns about people's safety. So I defend what we did within the Care Act on that, but I'm very happy to discuss with you any improvements that should be made.
Okay, thanks for that. It was good to actually hear from a lawyer direct. He's also put that question down on a piece of paper and charging you 25 quid for it, so... Next question.
Hello, good morning. My name is Johnny O'Hagan. I'm an AMP, been an AMP for many years. I thought the two speeches were very powerful and very moving. But at the heart of it, for me, as well as the bureaucratic side of it, as well as ensuring people's rights are upheld, I think we need to, as a society, treat people with compassion, respect, empathy and dignity. But how do we integrate that into policy, and how do we take that forward? Because that, to me, is the key, the way we treat people.
Well, Sarah, do you want to go first?
I think that's a really good question, and I think part of the problem is that the values and qualities that learning disabled people in particular bring aren't actually recognised by a lot of people. And so I think that really it's beholden upon anybody who works in health or social care to get down and go and hang out with learning disabled people. And once you've done that for a little while, you'll certainly change the way you practice and the way that you accept the totally unacceptable. So I think mix, hang out with people, simple as that.
Well, I mean, I totally agree with you. And when I said during my contribution that I come across people the whole time who lead by example and who are seeking to change and confront the unacceptable practices, that's how you change things. And it's about recruiting the right people into these services, people with the right values. Training, of course, also is vitally important. But I just think about a woman who leads the Children's Learning Disability Service in Norfolk, and she's someone who's worked in institutions but now leads a community-based service. And when she came to see me, she said that she couldn't imagine any cases, or very, very few cases, where teenagers needed to be in an institution for any longer than a short space of time for assessment and treatment, and that her whole mission was to keep families together. And she talked to me, this is the leader of the service, how she at times would spend a weekend with a family getting them through a crisis. And that sort of inspired leadership gets the whole culture of that organisation working in the right way. It's leaders like that we need across the system, and we need to give them the power to change things. And I'm sorry, I need to get a train to Norwich now, which is a bit of a nightmare, but I get there sometime in the early evening ready for my advice surgery. So thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.
If we've got any other questions, now that Norman's gone, you can slag him off, that's okay. Then again, you did anyway, so... have you got one? Oh, right at the top, look at that.
Chris Pearson from the Health Board in North Wales, and also worked for a substantial amount of time within the local authority. Sarah, I was just reflecting on your points about how at one point somebody can be in a professional position and people listen to what you say. When you become a carer, the position changes. And why is that? It can't be to do with who you are. It's more about what you are and what people see you as. And why should we not take cognizance of what people have to say? If we reflect upon the Staffordshire scandal and the way that people were damned for speaking out, one in particular, a lady took a huge amount of criticism, not just by those in charge of the hospital, but also from the public, as though there's something wrong about making complaints. And I think maybe we need to reflect upon how we deal with complaints in the early stages. Because I do think that there is an automatic response of protecting the organisation, as opposed to what is it this person is saying and what is it we can do to change what's happening. It isn't about training, in my view. It is about reflecting upon how we deal with people face to face. And what is it that people are asking for? They're asking for proper care. What's the problem with that? And yet there seems to be this barrier goes down as soon as somebody wants to say, I am concerned about whatever's happening to my relative. And there needs to be a whole shift, I think, particularly around those who are involved in governance. It's interesting that when the Mental Health Act Code of Practice was rewritten for both England and Wales, that the issues around governance, particularly those who were involved in registration and inspection, only have to take account of the Code of Practice, as opposed to being a duty to take account of and be held accountable to. So I think there are issues around organisations being held accountable.
Thanks for that. I'll just briefly say that, in fact, I was writing a blog about Connor's time in the unit, anonymously at the time, and about 6 weeks before he died, I flagged up that he'd had an epileptic seizure after drug change, and the staff hadn't noticed. The day after Connor died, the Trust actually circulated a briefing to the local authority, the commissioners, NHS England, called A Briefing on the Mother's Blog. And this briefing said that they'd been following my blog, and it was potentially going to cause reputational damage. And the particular entry that could cause some damage was my entry on May the 21st about Connor having a seizure. Instead of actually acting on the content of that blog and listening to it, and the actual content raising alarm bells, they didn't even register the content. They focused on the reputation. So I completely agree with you that there is a rotten culture here in which families are complainants, and I refuse to call myself a complainant because I'm not complaining about anything. I'm trying to get accountability. And you're slapped with that label, you're treated as difficult, and the irony is I've actually got quite a good job, and I do all right, my PDRs are fine, and yet I've been treated as if I'm some sort of demonic monster, and I find it absolutely outrageous.
Anyone else? If you haven't got any, we're going to just sit in silence, so just... You got one over there. There you go.
Oh yeah, thank you. My name's Yvonne Quinn. I'm an AMP and I work in a learning disability and autism team. I don't think things are changing very much or very quickly, and that's really, really sad. I'm not advocating it as a way of working, but we get lots of people that are really severely challenging and autistic, and we haven't got the resources to place people. People are still being shipped hundreds of miles from home. As frequent and as near as yesterday, we're still having to do that locally, and it's appalling. And I'm really worried, listening to yourself, Sarah, that how we're going to affect any change and get some value. On a personal level, my 19-year-old grandson has a learning disability and lots of problems, and I am a complaining social worker, a grandma to be avoided. It's an uphill battle, so I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Anyone else? I'll have some. No, we can't. It says question and answers, and that's what we're going to have. There we go. Go on up there. The most inconvenient place you could be there as well.
Hi, my name's Scott, I'm an AMP. I wanted to ask Norman this question, but
He's gone.
Yeah. Well, I think he would have called me unconstructive anyway, but no, I just felt, it's just a point really, I just felt he was a little bit hypocritical standing up there discussing the impact on children's mental health and reduced budgets when, since the 2010 coalition government, an extra 500,000 children are now living in poverty. And as Norman was part of that government. I just wanted to see whether he would accept that the impact of austerity has been part of that increase of children now living in poverty, and the links between poverty and mental health are very clear, as we all know.
Well, you'll have to email them. Has anyone got any other questions, or do you want to get your coffee? I know the social workers will say, "Let's get coffee." They're already on their way out. Yeah, filling your pockets with free biscuits. Let's go get coffee, and we'll be back shortly. Thank you.